Okay, this is the third video going over assignment 3, the annotated bibliography, and I'm going to go over the example on the handout. As I mentioned in the first two videos, the first one is just going over the general instructions, and the second one is the rationale for why you're doing the annotated bibliography, and I also provided the structure. Now I'm going to go over the actual structure, an example for the annotated bibliography. Um, so, oh, and this is what I forgot to mention in the previous video when I went over the overall structure. So you notice that I have part one, part two, part three, part four. All right, these are just to indicate the different parts or sections of the annotated bibliography and how to structure it or put it together. So when you submit the assignment to me either on the 27th or the 31st or whenever the due date is marked on the syllabus, you're not going to put these headers or these headings, okay? Because it's going to look like this, or sorry, this one example. All right, so like this is part one. This paragraph right here is part two. These two small paragraphs is from part three. This is question one, and this is question two, and this right here is part four. Okay, so this is how so this is what your entries are going to look like for the four sources that you have located for your research. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna just read through this. Okay, so the book that I used is Henry Lefebvre Henry, 1991, Social Space, the Production of Space by Blackwell Publishers Ltd, Oxford, from pages 68 to 168. Just to sort of let you know, this is actually a truncated version of my annotated bibliography from when I started this research project like years ago. And my annotated bibliography was about like 10 to 12 pages long. And the reason why it was that long and single spaced was because I broke it up into different sections. So then what I did for this example is I just created a truncated version of uh, bibliographic reference, or sorry, annotated bibliography that I did for this particular source that I use in my own work. Okay. And also, this paragraph is actually uh, an amalgamation of like 5 or 6 different paragraphs. Okay. All right. So you just understand like the context from which I'm approaching this example. Okay. All right. So I wrote the summary for this particular chapter. The production of space primary thesis is how space is socially produced. Space results from historical, political, cultural, economic, and material conditions that combine in unique and interesting combinations. Lefebvre assumes that space is not neutral or static, but is a dynamic element of structuring social interactions. Geographic location, buildings, infrastructure, patterns, and ideological underpinnings such as race and ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality shape social interactions. Since space is socially produced and active, Lefebvre continues to say that there are two distinct views of space. First, there is mental space, and the second, there is physical space. Mental space is the way people and communities think about space. Contrast to physical space is how material aspects of spatial forms can shape the quality and kinds of social interactions. In a sense, following Lefebvre's explanation, space is dialectical. All right, so that's the summary of this particular chapter from what I just explained a few moments ago. Okay, and this is sort of what I mean. That excuse me. So what I argue in the book that I'm editing is that we have to sort of that we need to consider as researchers and sociologists that we need to think about how space is not only a product of human interactions, right? Like when we interact with other people, either known or the stranger, as George Simmel would say, but that space is also an active element in how we interact with each other, right? Because uh, in a general sense, most people tend to look at space or certain like geography, right, as something that's static and unchanging, which is not correct because of how like what is it, geology looks at the movement of like tectonic plates and the changing nature of the landscape, but that takes like years or generation or millennia, right? So then that's sort of the ossification of the understanding of geography, or and especially this idea of social space. So that's sort of the argument that Henry Lefebvre is making in this particular chapter, and also the overall argument of his book, to the importance and to learn how to recognize how to study and understand space as an important element in not only understanding human creativity and interactions, but also how it contributes to a lot of those things. Right. So like that's sort of the gist. But the point is that when you're writing this summary for the four sources that you located for your particular research, is that you have to sort of provide the information, ensuring that your reader understands how you are representing the information from the sources. So you're sort of like the devil's advocate, where you're representing your sources. So you have to be very detailed oriented, and you have to be very specific, right? And not providing like very broad comments where I can't distinguish if you're representing what the author is saying or is just something that you're just writing down to fill up space. All right. So if you notice, the way that I write this is also very specific to what Lefebvre says. All right. So that's what you're also going to be doing for this particular assignment. So then once you're done with the summary, then you're going to go to part 3, or questions 1 and question 2. So this is question 1, where I ask you to address why did you select that particular source? And I wrote, Lefebvre's methodology assists in understanding how to sensitize my thinking and observations about spatial formations. Using Lefebvre's trifecta of conceived space, representational space, and space as a representation to show how political figures, financial investors, urban planners, and community members understand spatial forms, and how each social group would think of and use space differently, leads to contradictions. So what I'm saying here is, depending from what position a person occupies in society, they're going to look at geography or the idea of social space in a different way. Political figures might look at social space as, well, who are the people who live in that community that are willing to vote for me? And what can I do for them or say to them that's going to convince them to vote for me? All right. For a financial investor, their whole thing would be, well, how am I able to make money if I invest money in this community? Like investing money to build homes or to upgrade and update like existing infrastructure, right? Or things of that nature, or even expanding certain communities. If the space itself is amenable to that, right? Oh, excuse me. All right. And then you have the urban planners, but definitely community members look at the community as a place where they're going to live. They're going to raise their family, make social connections, or make long lasting social connections with the other members who live in the community, in that general vicinity. So when you actually pay attention to social spaces or communities or neighborhoods or even geography, you could start paying attention and sort of look at the different social groups that exist out in society and what their interests are in terms of how a space is experienced and how that space structures experience among the people who are involved in that particular location, if that makes any sense. Okay. Now, and then for number 2, This is what I wrote, and just to remind you, question number 2 is just asking why did I decide to use this particular, or sorry, how does this particular source add to my research? And this is what I wrote. Lefebvre's work adds to my analysis by assisting me with conducting spatial analysis from a materialist perspective. Space, as Lefebvre presents throughout his study, is the need to incorporate spatial analysis as an important element of philosophical, political, economic, and more importantly, social understanding. Right. So that's sort of what I mentioned earlier. Okay. And then this right here is part 4. All right. And this is what I wrote. And I just borrowed a concept from the paragraph addressing point question number 1, and that's representational space. So, representational space is how discursive and aesthetic principles represent a given spatial form. So that's how Lefebvre defines this term. All right. So this is how he operationalizes it. Right. And then this last section is how I intend to use this concept in my own work. Right. So then I wrote, Panorama City was once viewed as a community to work in, have children, and raise a family, and live comfortably in a working class community. This view changed during a pivotal restructuring of California's political, cultural, and economic landscape during the 1990s when the national economy was changing. So then what this last part is referring to right here is actually going back to the 1990s when like globalization became a thing. You also had the establishment of NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a multilateral trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, because it restructured not only the economies of these respective 3 countries, but it literally just restructured the economy where manufacturing jobs would be shipped either to Mexico or other places around the world. And then that caused an economic crisis in places like California, because California, due to the Cold War, was a manufacturing hub, just like Detroit and the Rust Belt. And the Rust Belt in the United States is like the middle part of the United States, going from like Chicago all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. All right. Okay. So then, yeah. So like, this is pretty much how your annotated bibliography is going to look like. So you want to make sure that it looks exactly like this example. Okay. So you have part 1, part 2, part 3, and then part 4. So I'm going to stop it here, and that's it for this particular YouTube tutorial. And then I'm also going to do a tutorial showing you how to look for articles in a couple of the online databases. Okay. All right. Bye.